It's difficult not to marvel at the genius of the late pagan world. Philosophers such as Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, and Damascius are absolute intellectual titans, despite their works often going profoundly understudied these days. Indeed, a text like The Elements of Theology by Proclus is one of the standout classics of all Western philosophy, at least to my mind. But what's fascinating even more than that is that all of these philosophers shared in common a reverence for a single scripture, a revelation from divinity. This scripture detailed the nature of the gods, both hidden and manifest, along with many other divine beings, the nature of the cosmos, and the means by which human beings could, most importantly, achieve salvation. Indeed, the titanic genius of Iamblichus and Proclus was turned to compose extensive commentaries on just this scriptural revelation. This text, this scripture, was seemingly revealed in the time of the Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius, and it proved to be illuminating enough to inspire who we now call the Neoplatonists, and given the ravages of history and the ultimate triumph of Christianity, this revelation, known as the Chaldean Oracles, along with those commentaries, are effectively lost. Indeed, one of the great intellectual and spiritual tragedies of our culture, now known only through fragmentary quotations. What can we deduce about the contents of these Chaldean oracles? Why did these obscure hexameter verses so inspire the twilight of pagan genius? And what can we learn about their salvific concept of theurgy? Let's explore the Chaldean oracles, the now lost scripture of pagan Neoplatonism. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history, and if you'd like to support the work providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this episode, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon or some of the cool merch that we have. And if you're new to the study of Western esotericism, make sure to check out my study guide, which will give you a bit of the lay of the land of reliable texts and studies in the topic. And if you're interested in actual historical books on topics in the occult and the mystical, check out my bookstore over at Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description, and you can find them in the pinned comment below. But now, let's turn to the mysterious and sadly lost scripture of late pagan theurgy, the Chaldean Oracles. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. These days, we don't typically associate philosophy with religious piety. Indeed, since the 17th century, at least here in the West, philosophy and religion have significantly parted ways. Philosophy seeing itself as a kind of skeptical corrective to knowledge and power arrived at through faith and dogma. It's not totally a bad thing in the end. But this shift is certainly not representative of the history of philosophy more generally, and in the late classical world, then dominated by the philosophy that we now call Middle and Neo-Platonism, this was anything other than the case. Philosophy was a way of life, not just an academic discipline. It was a means of thinking, very often in the service of what we would now call something like religion. And though, tragically, as I pointed out in the introduction, the central scripture of this religious, or at least soteriological philosophy, the Chaldean Oracles, is now basically lost, mere fragments preserved in other works, sadly. Now, a couple of caveats for this specific episode. Given that the text is known only through those fragments and religious expressions found in writers that accepted the divine origins of the oracles, what can we actually reconstruct is pretty tenuous and sometimes even bordering on the speculative. We don't know the original nature of the text, we don't know the original ordering of the fragments themselves, and as you can probably imagine, being revealed oracular literature, they're already pretty obscure to start with. Further, the philosophers that accepted, commented, and expounded upon this text as basically a kind of scripture, they didn't agree with one another either, despite us all grouping them together into a single basket of Middle Platonism or Neo-Platonism. Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, and Damascius, much less the Christians, especially the Byzantine philosopher Michael Psellus, well, they didn't really agree with one another. And yet, at least the non-Christians here, use the oracles as scriptural proof texts for their philosophical positions. Positions, again, which were not logically consistent from philosopher to philosopher. It's a bit like knowing the Israelite prophet Isaiah, but only knowing it from fragments of the writings of Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, and John Wesley. Yeah, those guys are all Christians. They're all Christians quoting Isaiah, but can we really trust deriving the actual meaning of the original text of Isaiah from context in which the text is being quoted and is being done so from very different theological and philosophical ends, even if those are all roughly Christian? So again, what can we deduce about the contents, the theology, the cosmology, and the theory of salvation from the Chaldean Oracles is going to be forever provisional, unless by some, please God, miracle, they show up one day in some long-lost papyrus, which is still possible. At least one can hope. So what are the Chaldean Oracles? It was apparently composed as at least one text in Greek hexameters, which is the classical poetic form of scripture going back to Hesiod and Homer, probably revealed either by Julian the Chaldean or his son Julian the Theurgist, probably during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, so roughly around 161 to 180 or just a little bit after. The father and son duo may have been from Roman Syria, and hence the sense of the text being Chaldean, though to be clear, they don't really betray much in the way of Eastern, whatever Eastern means. They don't betray much in the way of Eastern religious or philosophical concepts, and the language and most of the ideas are basically a composite of Hellenic mythology, mystery religion, and the philosophical speculations that we typically associate now with Middle Platonism. Indeed, the specifically philosophical content seems either influenced by or influenced, especially by the Neo-Pythagorean philosopher Numenius of Apamea, who needs his own episode desperately. Exactly how the oracles emerged from the father and son Julians isn't really clear, though the leading line of speculation, at least these days, is that Julian the Theurgist, the son of this duo, may have composed or revealed them in a kind of ecstatic state of inspiration. Thus, they're revealed as much as they are composed, and I think the idea that they're a fraud that you sort of see back in the early 20th century is ridiculous. That they were of an inspired, authoritative character was just accepted by the leading philosophers of the day, and they quote the oracles as such, and again, that's the only reason why they survive. However, even some Platonizing Christians were impressed with them enough to have to at least compete with them as a kind of competitor revelation. And those would include folks like Arnobius of Sicca, Marius Victorinus, Synesius of Cyrene, Eusebius of Caesarea, the church historian, and most importantly Michael Psellus, who even prepared a Christianized interpretation of them as late as the 11th century, which also only survives in a fragmentary state. History really is a slaughter bench, Hegel. The contents of the oracles, on the other hand, were concerned with theology, cosmology, and especially the means of achieving salvation of the soul through the process of both contemplation and theurgy, or sacramental partnership with the divine, all of this couched in the Middle Platonic philosophy and the Hellenistic mysticism of the time. And in this way, the Chaldean oracles are probably best compared to the numerous other mystical ascent philosophies of that time, especially something like Hermeticism and so-called Gnosticism, what John Dillon denotes as the underworld of Platonism, but probably also something like Jewish proto-Merkava mysticism, and in some ways even early Catholicism. You can think of sacramentalism and theurgy having a lot in common, in fact. In fact, I would have referred to all of this as the Platonic underground and thought of Iamblichus and Proclus as like insufferable hipsters, scene kids, but that's just me. But what can we deduce from the oracles, even if we can do so only admittedly pretty provisionally? The oracles seem to have taught of the existence of an abyssal, transcendent father deity who is snatched away and which existed outside all of being, but from which all being emerged. From this divine void emerged a fiery, self-thinking thought, which generates the Platonic forms, the blueprint of all reality. This entity seems to have been in a dyadic nature, a dyadic existence, in one sense oriented toward the divine abyss, and in the other structuring the divine thoughts into formal reality. In this thinking structure mode, this entity is the demiurge, or craftsman of reality as we know it, and from this dynamism a third deity emerges, a feminine dynamic power denoted as Hecate, who functions as a membrane, literally a hymen in Greek, through which creative thought flows out as reality. Indeed, all souls are said to actually flow specifically from her right hip, with her as a kind of world spirit. Further, she seems to have also been the focus of a great deal of the more quasi-magical theurgical rituals that I'll be discussing here in just a minute. I mean, she is Hecate after all. But at this point, your Middle Platonic, Gnostic, Judean, Phalonic, Hermetic, Stoic, that fiery bit, your Stoic bells, all of these bells should be going off. Yep, something like this Trinitarian structure was ubiquitous at the time, with a Deus absconditus generating a fiery logos-like thought demiurge mediated by or somehow with a feminine entity such as Ennoia, Barbello, Sophia, Chokhmah, wisdom in various forms. And here the Chaldean oracles are very much at home with the soteriological speculations of the first few centuries of the Common Era. So one might think of these as kind of a neighborhood of very similar philosophies in some ways. And like in some other systems, something had to fill the gulf between the abyssal deity and apparent reality, pure spiritual thought, and material existence. These intermediary entities consisted of the yinges, the couriers, or the medium by which divine thought was transmitted, the connectors, which were the invisible structural support of the cosmos, a bit like the metaphysical framework holding everything together or protecting the structure of reality as such. Further, the teletarchs of faith, hope, and especially love function as quasi-divine rulers which administer the cosmos at large. Again, unlike the Sethian system, in which the archons are basically evil, demonic prison wardens of reality, the system of the Chaldean oracles sees the archons, or the rulers of reality, to in fact be expressions of divine grace and benevolence. So even if they're structurally homologous to so-called Gnosticism or Sethianism, quite different here in tenor. In addition to this Trinitarian structure, there were also apparently legions of daemones, or spirits, from angel-like hymn-singing beings to more proletarian cosmos builders, and then of course to a range of malevolent demonic entities which would seek to ensnare the soul in matter for whatever reason. All of these entities serve both cosmological functions as well as theurgical ones. The Ienges are the medium and the message through which divine thought is channeled, especially through quasi-magical practices. The connectors are the path back to the Divine One, especially as the soul mounts up upon the rays of the especially solar connectors, and the teletarchs of hope, love, and especially faith, at least for Proclus, are the means by which connection with the divine is established through spiritual purification, and most importantly, through theurgy. Reality itself was also structured into a triune system composed of the Empyrean realm of the purely intelligible, the ethereal world of the stellar regions, and the material sublunar world of matter down here, ruled by fate, held fast by Eros, and moved about by Ion, or time. The material world was conceived as the lowest region, which is pretty typical of the period, and thus, of course, the least perfect. It's a temporary abode of the soul, akin to a home basically unfit for spiritual habitation. And while the oracles do share in the generally hylophobic tendencies of the time, we don't seem to have the radical dualism apparent in Sethian, or even some Hermetic tracts, or sometimes even frankly in Plotinus, who was said by Porphyry to have been ashamed to have even had a body. Though the text does seem to equate the material realm with Hades, so that's a 1-star review. The Anthropology of the Oracles is somewhat Platonic in that the human being is unique in all of reality, in that we are composed of both matter and mind, stuff and spirit. I mean, the question for the oracles is basically one of human comportment. If we align ourselves via our spiritual natures, in fact our true natures via contemplation and theurgy, we can ultimately rise back to our true divine home. However, our natural condition is one of enslavement, or typically they use the language of intoxication with the material world, and we need to sober up, a phrase that's used in both the Chaldean Oracles, but also in the Hermetic literature, and I believe often in Christianity as well. We have to sober up to our actual spiritual natures. And here the text seems to distinguish between people who are theurgists, or the herd, or as Iamblichus has it, those who are spirituals, those who are parts of the herd, and those who are in the middle men, struggling perhaps to find our way in this world. And a similar distinction is also to be found in some Gnostic literature, especially this distinction between the spirituals and the hylics in some Valentinian texts. Now, if we're doomed to one condition or the other doesn't seem to be terribly clear, but it's implied. For those who fail to rise back up to their spiritual homes, well, they're doomed to reincarnation. Though, unlike Plotinus, the oracles seem to reject the idea that you can be reincarnated back into animals or into plants. You just get put back into another human meat machine. While theology and cosmology, of course, discussed in the Chaldean Oracles, their primary concern, a bit again like Hermetic texts, is spiritual salvation. And in this way, these texts are very similar to other literature of the time. They're using the machinery of Greek philosophy to achieve salvation. However, what does seem to set the oracles apart is its primary focus on the purification and salvation of the soul through not only contemplation, but especially theurgy. In fact, it seems that Julian the Theurgist actually coined that very term, theurgy, perhaps to differentiate his means of salvation from theologia, or mere speculation about the gods. You don't need to just think about the gods, you need to be about the gods. Theurgy is therefore applied theology. In other words, theurgy is the means by which human beings spiritually conjoin and interact with divine beings, ultimately in the interests of salvation. But how? The first means is through conjunction with the divine, and this seems to have been achieved through at least two means. One was using quasi-magical-like divine speech, often mantra-like strings of vowels, to bridge that very gap back to the world of the divine. And similar types of incantations were also used in both Gnostic, Hermetic, and Greco-Egyptian magical literature. So it's the kind of strings that we see in other literature. Another apparent means to interact with the divine was through the inges, was through a spinning wheel device, or a strophalos. This magical wheel of Hecate was apparently a golden ball encrusted with a sapphire and engraved with various magical images and texts. This ball was spun around by the theurgist via a leather strap, thus sympathetically imitating the perfectly circular motion of the heavenly spheres above us. This connection via imitatio Dei, literally the movement of the spheres by God, and you're doing something similar, and the system of cosmic sympathy and symbula would bridge the gap between the human soul and the spiritual divine realm. It could also allow the human being to become a partner in creation and thus even alter nature. In the case of Proclus and Julian the Chaldean, who both apparently used theurgy to make it rain, not like that, like rain, during a couple of droughts, a feat also known in the history of Jewish theurgy as being accomplished a la Choni the Circle Maker. It's likely a range of magical devices were probably used in theurgical practice, though their nature is now either very obscure or completely lost. Another form of important theurgy was through the animation of divine statues, a practice we know about through Hermetic, Greek, and Egyptian circles. This was apparently achieved again through the sympathetic use of animals, plants, herbs, stones, incantations, libations, etc., specifically to the divine being sought. By conjuring the deity into the statue through a kind of, not exactly persuasion, but a kind of luring them in, this allowed the theurgist to commune with the entity and apparently allowed for a more direct experience of the divine and spiritual illumination with the proximity of the deity in the statue. It's also possible to summon a divine being to temporarily dwell within a human vessel. This rite of binding and loosening was apparently achieved through various kinds of purifications, seemingly through fire and water, but also by the subject emptying their mind or their spirit, thus allowing space, so to speak, for the deity to dwell inside the human being. Seemingly 2 people were required for this, a so-called caller who would induce the deity, and a receiver in which the deity would dwell. Further rituals were probably done as well, but the hoped-for result was basically possession by a divine being. Hecate seems to have been an especially important target deity, and rather dazzling reports from both callers and receivers are attested, such as the appearance of a fiery child or a formless fire, a dazzling horse, and, of course, sumptuous light. And again, we have this information, but it's so tantalizingly little about these rituals and their outcomes, but they are attested to by the greatest philosophers of the day, Proclus, Iamblichus, and others, as positively stunning and transformatory. Of course, such feats of magic and mysticism were probably amazing. The core concern of the Chaldean Oracles was the process of Theurgy, specifically in the service of anagoge, or ascent of the soul back to the divine realm. But to understand the process of ascent of the soul, we have to discuss the descent of the soul into the material world. And to do that, we have to discuss one of the most confusing concepts in all of late classical philosophy, the so-called soul vehicle. For various reasons, philosophers of this period were concerned about the mechanism by which the purely spiritual soul entered into the material realm, including entering into the human body. For them, there had to be some kind of metaphysical transitional state for the soul as it descended down into the material world. Thus, they theorized that the soul became surrounded with a kind of ethereal. Remember, the ether is the world where the stars exist, and so it's the stuff which compose the stars, which are not quite spiritual in nature, but not quite matter or hule either. And you get a kind of ethereal accretion or a shell, something like a ethereal cocoon. This ethereal cocoon or soul vehicle allowed the soul to transverse down through the ethereal realm and then finally to arrive into the material realm, just as rays of sunlight or astral radiation bathe and interact with the material world. But the nature, composition, and ultimate destiny of the soul vehicle varies greatly from philosopher to philosopher, and it even survived into the Renaissance. Agrippa even confusingly just sort of name drops a soul vehicle in the 3 books of occult philosophy. Who knows what he meant to by it. The oracles also seem to admit that the soul vehicle would return back ultimately to the ethereal realm, sort of shed as the soul journeyed back to the purely spiritual realm, and that position was ultimately adopted by Iamblichus as well, perhaps directly inspired by the revelations of the Chaldean Oracles. But all the confusion about the soul vehicle aside, the process of the return of the soul begins with mental purification, specifically the theurgical emptying out of the mind and communion with the divine, as we've already discussed with the magical formulas. There seems to have been a twofold process involved. One of a kind of interior purification by adopting a contemplative stance void of any specific thoughts, and of course the exterior rites of theurgy. These were working in a kind of circuit. And with that circuit, it stirs the soul back to begin its journey to the realm of the spiritual along the rays of the solar connectors. At the heart of this process was a kind of ritual death. In this state of ritual death, it appears that the soul could be further released from the body by inhaling the flowering flames of the Divine Father, which descended from the divine realm. This is perhaps a very obscure reference to maybe some breathing techniques. We don't know. With the soul detached and aided by another fellow theurgist, it would begin its journey with the aid of the three teletarchs and the connectors, along with various forms of angelic beings, back to the ethereal and ultimately into the spiritual realm. In this state of both meditative consciousness and theurgical enlightenment, it appears the goal was union with the divine world as represented by the light of the sun, which perhaps you would ultimately only be fully reunited in the divine realm following one's death, at least one's physical death. But recall that philosophy was often regarded as simply preparation for death, and this ritual death very likely would have set the stage for the actual eventual death of the body, basically practicing for the final spiritual act. This all said, it should be obvious that so much of the exact nature of the texts are unclear. The ritual praxis of theurgy is now basically lost to oblivion, and it's likely that even if we had the complete text, their oracular quality would prove grounds for lots of varying interpretations. Such was the case in antiquity. Even in antiquity, they don't agree with one another in their interpretations. But the surviving fragments and the discussion by these great philosophers do absolutely fire the imagination for a lost theurgical spirituality and a philosophy so apparently amazing and transformatory and beautiful that it gained the favor of people like Proclus, Iamblichus, and Damascius, among many, many others. But what we're left with now are just whispered echoes. The best edition of the fragments, along with a profoundly helpful introduction, is the edition of Ruth Majercik, which provides the fragments along with the framing text in both Greek and English. Though I should warn you that her introduction requires a good bit of knowledge of technical ancient philosophical Greek. She just straight up quotes stuff in ancient Greek, and she does not provide you a translation, so you'll need to brush up on your ancient Greek if you really want to take full advantage of her fantastic introduction. If you want to get a sense of the Chaldean Oracles and the wider philosophical landscape of the time, then John Dillon's The Middle Platonists is going to be your absolute best bet. It is a absolutely classic text, a real masterpiece, and well worth having on your shelf if you're interested in this period at all. Sarah Johnston's Hecate Sotera is a study of Hecate's role in the Chaldean Oracles and related similar literature, and it's absolutely also a must for studying the history and the role of Hecate in this literature. In fact, I might come back to make an episode on Hecate, though I think Dr. Angela Puka already has one, so make sure to consult that one. Finally, if you just want to read some of the oracles for free online, you can always consult the Thomas Taylor translation. It's of course a bit dated, but it does really give you some real sense of the mystery and the majesty of this literature. So check those out as well. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.